We know very well that throughout its entire history, the USSR kept telling the whole world that it was supposedly the most peace-loving country in the world, while everyone else was just preparing to destroy the young socialist state. We know this mantra well, but in reality, the Soviet Union repeatedly acted as a true and absolutely cynical aggressor. But you probably don't know how the USSR, in its desire to appear as an innocent victim, crossed all acceptable boundaries. You have probably never heard about how the Stalinist regime disregarded the norms of international order, for which it was justly punished. Most likely, you are not aware that the USSR was, for the first time at the official level, effectively declared an aggressor state. Today we will talk about how the USSR was shamefully expelled from the most important international organization of its time. We will look at how, back in 1939, Moscow was expelled from the League of Nations due to starting an aggressive and completely unjustified war. As always, the most accurate and objective analysis. My name is Semyon, this is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's begin. USSR. What was the League of Nations and what was it for? The League of Nations was established after the end of World War I, and that's not surprising at all. The war, which generals from all countries had planned to last only a few months, dragged on for 4 long years and claimed the lives of at least 10 million people. Unprecedented losses. Of course, people had fought wars before, but to have so many killed in such a short period of time was beyond anything imaginable. People had never killed each other so intensely before. And that's why, even before the guns fell silent on the Western Front, the best minds of humanity began to seriously think about how to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. How to make sure that humanity would not descend into another world war. The leader in this field was the then President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. He proposed creating an international organization that would be responsible for preventing military actions, ensuring collective security, and most importantly, regulating disputes between states through diplomatic negotiations. That is, this organization was supposed to become a kind of universal international negotiation platform where countries in conflict with each other would meet and come to an agreement, preventing bloodshed. As you may have guessed, this organization was called the League of Nations. Wilson's idea appealed to most Western European countries. That's why the point about creating the League of Nations was included in the final text of the treaty, the Peace Treaty, which legally summed up the results of World War I and established the post-war world order. The organization itself began operating on January 10, 1920, with the League of Nations headquarters located in neutral Switzerland in the city of Geneva. By the way, thanks to this, Geneva gained a reputation for many decades as the ideal place for holding various meetings, negotiations, and conferences. For example, it was here that the famous Geneva Conventions were signed concerning the protection of prisoners of war and the protection of civilians during wartime, which Putin's Russia has still not learned to observe. Or the Geneva Convention on Road Traffic, which established the format and procedure for issuing international driver's licenses. The irony of fate is that the initiator of the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson, was never able to convince his own country of the importance of such an organization after the war. The thing is, he was a representative of the Democratic Party, while the majority in Congress at that time belonged to the Republican Party, so they blocked all the president's initiatives. The United States never became a member of the League of Nations, and as a result, had minimal influence on political events within Europe. Later, historians would say that this policy of self-isolation, carried out by subsequent presidents, became one of the main reasons for the start of World War II. And indeed, who knows, if the United States had been part of the League of Nations, it's quite possible that Hitler and Mussolini wouldn't have been so bold. And it's possible that the war might not have started at all, or at least wouldn't have been so destructive, if Western democracies had acted more decisively and in a more united way. How did the USSR's policy change? Now let's talk about our peace-loving Soviet Union. What does it have to do with all this, huh? Since Grandpa Lenin came to power in 1917, Soviet Russia, and later the USSR, was not recognized by almost all the countries of the world. And that's not surprising, since they were bloody. The Bolshevik regime openly called for the overthrow of legitimate governments in all countries of the world and the implementation of a world revolution. And even in their anthem, which was then called the Internationale, there are lines: "We will destroy the whole world of violence to its foundations, and then we will build a new world of our own. Who was nothing will become everything." In my opinion, it's hard to find a clearer call for revolution. And who would want to deal with such unreasonable people after that? However, by the mid-1920s, the situation began to change significantly. All attempts to ignite the flame of communism in the heart of Europe ended in complete failure. Not a single pro-Soviet regime in either Germany or Hungary proved to be viable, so the Bolsheviks had to curb their ambitions somewhat, realizing that the world revolution was being postponed indefinitely. Lenin and later Stalin put on a peace-loving pose and, most importantly, a willingness to engage in dialogue, in other words, to restore mutually beneficial relations with the West. Whether they liked it or not, Soviet diplomats still had to put on long tailcoats and top hats and go negotiate with the countries of Western Europe. And in 1922, the Soviet government was recognized by Germany and later by Britain, France, Italy, and other European countries. The USSR established not only permanent diplomatic relations but also trade relations which were mutually beneficial for both sides. This became especially noticeable during the period of Stalin's industrialization, since the Soviets, just like the modern Russian Federation, couldn't produce anything worthwhile. Raw materials and semi-finished products, coal, timber, ore, and grain were exported, and the foreign currency earned was used to buy necessary technologies from the West. And look, nothing has fundamentally changed in 100 years. Russia is pathologically unable to create any kind of high-tech product that would be in demand in other countries, and that's why it prefers to live exclusively off its natural resources. And in order not to completely slip back into the Stone Age, Moscow continues to buy or otherwise acquire various new technologies. Voila, a stranger among them. In short, by the early 1930s, the USSR already had a fairly strong position in the international balance of Europe. Its influence was due not only to the restoration of economic ties with the West, but also to cleverly constructed propaganda. The USSR not only positioned itself as a peace-loving state, but also as the sole defender against fascism and Nazism, which were indeed gaining serious momentum in those years. At the same time, it accused Western democracies of weakness, cowardice, and indecisiveness. And for many representatives of European society, this message resonated. The culmination of this was in 1933 when Hitler came to power, the year Germany became the main center of global aggression. Since Hitler never hid his contemptuous attitude toward the League of Nations, just a few months after the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship, Germany withdrew. Japan also withdrew from the League of Nations along with Germany, having also become an aggressor state, but only in East Asia. Because the United States kept its self-isolation policy, Great Britain and France led the League of Nations. And right away they came up with the idea to fill the void with the Soviet Union. But still, you might ask, how did it happen that democratic states invited a totalitarian state like the USSR into their club? That the British and the French, who were trying to preserve the world order, drew closer to a state that from the very beginning aimed to destroy that very order? Did London and Paris really not see that, despite the outwardly peaceful appearance, the USSR still continued to strive for the spread of communism? First in Europe and then throughout the world? How did their intelligence services miss it, and what were Western politicians thinking? The answer is simple. It was out of a primitive fear of war, of a new world war, France especially. If the United Kingdom could feel relatively safe on its island, then France was directly bordering Germany. And in the event of a new war, it needed a strong ally, or at least a serious partner in diplomatic games against Hitler. Moreover, in French political circles, the memory was still strong of how the Russian Empire had been their ally in World War I, and how the suicidal offensive of the General's Army on the Eastern Front saved Paris in 1914. As you correctly understood, it was France that initiated the inclusion of the USSR in the League of Nations. Moreover, the Soviet government, represented by People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs Maxim Litvinov, had absolutely no objections, since it sought to use this international platform to promote its own ideas. While formally expressing a desire to maintain peace in Europe, Britain also had no objections. Therefore, on September 15th, the USSR became a full member of the League of Nations. Looking ahead, it should be noted that none of the expectations were fulfilled. The Soviet Union did not become a reliable partner or ally for France. And moreover, at the decisive moment, Stalin chose an alliance with Hitler by signing the famous Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and dividing Eastern Europe between them. But Moscow also failed to achieve anything as a member of the League of Nations, and finally became convinced that in order to advance communism, instead of soft power, it was necessary to use hard power in the form of tanks, cannons, airplanes, and the victorious Red Army, which, of course, never attacks anyone but only defends. Straight out of Putin's propaganda playbook is the claim that Russia never starts wars. After all, Josef Vissarionovich became Putin's perfect teacher. The most peace-loving country in the world. Actually, that's historical truth. It should be noted that the USSR should have been boldly expelled from the League of Nations immediately after its first act of aggression, that is, after September 17, 1939. Let me remind you that Germany attacked Poland on September 1, and 16 days later, Stalin struck the bleeding Poles in the back. Be sure to watch our video about how Lviv defended itself in 1939. There, the reasons and circumstances of the USSR's attack on Poland are examined in more detail, which brought a lot of grief not only to the Poles, but also to Ukrainians, Belarusians, and other free peoples. However, in September 1939, Stalin got away with everything. He explained his treacherous attack on an independent state to the whole world very simply, as the necessity to protect the lives, property, and population of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. The fact that the residents themselves never asked for his protection did not matter at all. Two totalitarian states, Germany and the USSR, squeezed Poland in a pincer attack and cynically divided its territory. But in the eyes of the international community, it was Hitler who was seen as the aggressor, because he attacked first. And today, if you ask the average European who started World War II, you will get a clear answer: Nazi Germany. And the USSR was sort of left out. What can I say? History is written by the victors. But Moscow wasn't able to dodge responsibility for very long. Just a few months after the Polish campaign, the USSR once again showed the world its aggressive nature, this time barely disguised. We're talking about the attack on Finland. We have a separate video about the legendary Soviet-Finnish War, which I also strongly recommend watching, but I will still briefly remind you of its causes. Before the 1917 revolution, Finland was part of the Russian Empire with autonomous rights, but as a result of the Bolshevik coup and the Civil War, it managed to declare and defend its independence, just like Poland and the Baltic countries. However, Moscow's imperial ambitions did not disappear. They simply lay low and bided their time for more than 20 years. Just like post-Soviet Russia, which at first recognized Ukraine as an independent state, signed a pile of agreements with it, and then began to deliberately destroy it. And then came 1939, when tactical retreat was replaced by aggressive advance. According to the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Finland fell into the Soviet sphere of influence. In line with Stalin's plans, it was supposed to become a separate Soviet republic. For this purpose, a puppet state called the Finnish Democratic Republic was proclaimed, and even a so-called people's government was formed, headed by the Finnish communist Otto Kuusi. By the way, he hadn't been to Finland itself for almost 20 years, and had been living off Moscow's resources all that time. Then Comrade Stalin remembered him and decided to use him for the benefit of the world proletarian revolution, and after that, everything was quite simple. To create a formal pretext for invading Finland on November 26, 1939, Soviet intelligence services carried out a staged provocation, the so-called Mainila incident. Supposedly, cunning Finnish artillerymen shelled the border Soviet village of Manila, but no one believed this, and on November 30, the Red Army invaded the territory of independent Finland. This is how the Soviet-Finnish, or as contemporaries called it, the Winter War began. But what interests us first and foremost is not the military events, but the reaction of the international community to this blatant act of aggression. There was a reaction, and it was quick, decisive, and tough. For starting the war on December 14, 1939, the most peace-loving country on the planet was shamefully expelled from the League of Nations. Moreover, the immediate reason for the USSR's expulsion was the mass protests from the international community over the systematic bombings by Soviet aviation of civilian targets in Finland, including the use of incendiary bombs. As you can see, Moscow remains true to its principles a century later. No mercy, no pity, not even for the civilian population. If anyone knows this, it's the people of Ukraine, who have been experiencing it firsthand for the past 3 years. The USSR is an aggressor state, and the expulsion of the USSR from the League of Nations became a kind of moral victory for Finland and for European democratic countries in general. In fact, this decision meant that the USSR was a true aggressor, unworthy of holding a place in an organization dedicated to maintaining peace. And I would like to point out that all the other aggressor countries, Germany, Japan, and Italy, left the League of Nations voluntarily. The USSR became the only country to be forcibly expelled, which once again highlights the deceitful and hypocritical nature of the Stalinist regime. However, it should be noted that the expulsion of the USSR from the League of Nations was still a symbolic gesture, and its practical benefit was close to zero. Neither the League of Nations nor its individual members could do anything to stop the Soviet-Finnish war or in any way help poor Finland. Although Great Britain and France promised to send their expeditionary corps to the Scandinavian peninsula, but the decision was constantly delayed, and as a result, the Finns were left alone to face the bloodthirsty totalitarian aggressor. All they could rely on was their own courage, a powerful system of fortifications, the harsh climate, and the military talent of Field Marshal Mannerheim. And this fact should be a lesson for modern Ukraine. In a war with a ruthless dictator, you can only count on your own strength. Excessive hope for outside help never leads to anything good. However, it should be emphasized that small but proud Finland behaved with great dignity, ultimately preserving its statehood, democratic system, market economy, and free society. And it did not even fall under Moscow's influence, as happened to many European countries after World War II. The Soviet-Finnish War itself became a real disgrace for the USSR, a testament to its total unpreparedness for genuine popular resistance and the blatant incompetence of the Red commanders led by Stalin's upstart, Marshal Voroshilov. Thus, justice ultimately prevailed, Stalin was left empty-handed, and the USSR went down in world history as an aggressor state on par with Hitler's Germany. Since the just decision of the League of Nations has never been overturned and never will be, that's all for now, everyone.